You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, Steve Davis of Smart Growth America joins the show to talk about their most recent edition of Dangerous by Design. We chat about where we stand on pedestrian traffic deaths in the United States, the data collected, and creating consequences for not improving safety. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of bus riders, bus drivers, and chupistas, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. And if you want to just give a single $1 a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to get the show in your podcatcher. We'll also recently put up some bonus material, including audio of my first ever e-bike ride, and have a weekly free post from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, get your heavyweight bus and bike scarves. You'll definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, just to show everyone in that city hall or legislature your advocacy in clothing that won't get taken by security on the way in. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. But there are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from us on the bookshop site, either the books from our authors that we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the 20-year-old newsletter we do at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 110,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes as well for that one too. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that as well. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up for you in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements on gatherings, but for now, just enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I decided to move this part of my thank yous up from the post-credits to right here smack dab at the start because I do want to recognize the folks who are Dallas tier or higher Patreon supporters. It really helps us out and we super appreciate it. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. So first names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mal, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Matthew, Sylvia, and recently added Andrew A. All right, thank you all very much. Let's get to the show. Steve Davis, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's great to be here, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Steve Davis. I'm the AVP of Transportation for Smart Growth America and manage all of our transportation programs, which includes Transportation for America. I've been at this work for a little while now. It kind of snuck up on me for a couple decades.
A little while
now, I know. You have kids and then the days go by really, really fast. But my background is actually in journalism. And that's how I ended up coming to Smart Growth America. I was just really relentlessly curious and connected with some folks here a long, long time ago. And I've somehow been here for 20 years this year, actually.
Oh, wow. So this is my 20th year of doing the newsletter. Started in 2006 when I was at Reconnecting America. So
yeah, we
were talking about that earlier. We've known each other a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's awesome. 20 years. So journalism, what were you focused on in journalism before you stepped in this direction?
I did a good bit of writing. I was a photojournalist, working mostly for newspapers before I departed. And like I often say, like a lot of former journalists, became a communications director.
Yeah, that was Gloria too, right? So she was Gloria was a journalist as well. She did fashion stuff for LA Weekly, which is really funny. You go from fashion to transportation real quick. Super interesting.
Well, and the person that I came here to work for, David Goldberg, who was really kind of responsible for getting me here. He was a journalist in Atlanta, and actually that was how I had the connection. I grew up in Atlanta and read his work in the Atlanta paper and had reached out to him at some point after he had come to Smart Growth America, and we had kind of formed a friendship a little little bit. And that was the door I came in through.
So what's different now from like 20 years ago in terms of your advocacy and your, I mean, little things maybe, but also big things?
Yeah, I mean, what's not different? I guess the biggest thing that's really different is just some of the blind spots that I think we had back then. I mean, we were so excited about the return to cities that was happening, in that the late 90s and the early 2000s, and in the midst of like gas prices that were getting over $1 for the first time, which is crazy to look back at. And there was this renewed vigor for cities and walkable places. And it was like the stuff that we believe is really desired by people and really wonderful for all these reasons, all of a sudden was becoming really popular. And it was like there was no downside to that. And, fast forward 20 years and seeing the sort of inequitable growth and the ways that that didn't benefit everyone, and I think some of the equity things that were going on that we didn't realize at the time, I think is one of the biggest changes. I still think it's wonderful that people want to live in great, connected, walkable places. To think about that in a slightly more nuanced way now, maybe than I did when I was, 25. I feel like that's definitely one of the big differences. So many things have changed though, and especially as sort of a former communications person, who worked on this, like it's a incredibly different landscape that you have to work in now. Just thinking about, we we still write a lot of blog posts, which maybe I don't think about as much being kind of strange because I'm 47 years old, and that was the time that was the coin of the realm.
Yeah,
But talk to our younger folks, and they're like, blog posts, like why are we still doing this? Like people read this stuff.
I do.
Yeah,
I
that's
do.
right. Um, anyway, so that's one thing that has also really changed from the communication side, is just trying to figure out the best way to do this work and to get people engaged in the advocacy and the messaging and all that kind of stuff. So much of that has changed. I do think a lot of things haven't changed, though. I think what people care about is really the same and hasn't changed all that much. It's really just how we tell people is dramatically different.
It's so interesting. I mean, I think that is an interesting kind of discussion to have, is like, what does get to people and what can you tell them? And, the visuals matter a lot more, even though they mattered before because you always had a picture with your blog if you wanted people to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
But the writing was really interesting, although there was a lot of it. But, I'm just curious about that. Like, how do you all kind of move forward in this world of short form video and TikToks and things like that?
It's a great question. For the first time this last year, I don't know how much our communications folks want me to like lift the curtain on this, but compared to what we did 10 years ago in this report, which was super heavy on reaching out to newspaper editorial boards and calling, metro desks on every one of the, whatever top 100 metro areas. Like a lot of those newspapers just don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The ones that still do exist, it might be, an editorial department of, 45 people that's down to like 7. And the person that might be reprinting the, press releases about traffic safety stuff is also doing the cops and doing the schools and, doing everything else. So the landscape is just so different. So one of the things that we kind of experimented with this year with Dangerous by Design was spending a little bit more time and money and effort in that ecosystem of like YouTube and content creators and all that kind of stuff. We've done more video, I mean, for a while now, for I don't know, since 5-6 years, mostly slightly longer form, sometimes, fun, cute little 3-4 minute illustration heavy kind of things. But like this year with Dangerous by Design, again, we have like a long in-depth story, 5-6 minutes on what's happened in Orlando that we can get into a little bit. But we also reached out to City Nerd. Ray Delahanty makes terrific videos, and we reached out to him with a partnership to talk about Dangerous by Design, which is kind of new.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot that could be done in that area to kind of get this story out and into different forms. What's really interesting too is, the the average age of the people that we talk to on Capitol Hill, we get older, they never change. The median Hill staffer that we're talking to, they're like 25, and that never changes, right? People come and go, and for the most part, whoever was around when the last reauthorization happened, they're not going to be around for the next one. They turn over a lot of times, in a 5-year period. I was talking to somebody recently, and they were saying like, we watch a lot of videos in our office. Like that's kind of what gets passed around. And, oh, did you see this? And did you see this video? It might be a short, might be a longer thing, but that's really kind of become a little bit of a preferred medium for people which is really interesting. So there's a lot more that can be done there. I still think we need, messages and formats that connect with people in some of the same old ways, but there's a lot of room to do a lot of things differently and a lot of things better and reach audiences. But ultimately what you're trying to do is solve the problem for an audience that's just become incredibly fragmented
Oh my
and
gosh, yeah.
atomized, right?
It's crazy. I
So
mean, the blogosphere, that was like where you got your information. And that was a new thing too. A lot of people who were
yeah,
newspaper folks were like, what's the blogosphere? You guys are crazy.
yeah.
But it's what we came up on. So it's how we're used to it. And then when Twitter came out, obviously it was very centralized for at least the
Mhm.
policy people and things like that. Not everybody got on Twitter and not everybody's still on Twitter. I don't use it anymore. But, that kind of format anyways, Blue Sky, Twitter, et cetera, Threads, kind of punches above its weight in terms of like the policy people that are on there, the news people that are on there, the everybody else. But the rest of the world is on the TikToks and the everything else and the videos and the Instagrams and whatever. So I always just think that's fascinating to see over time how things change. But let's talk about the report. So I want to talk to you about Dangerous by Design. How many years ago? You said 10 years, I think. How many years has it been since you guys started putting this out?
The first one that I worked on, I think was 2009. So it's been 17 years since the first one. And it's really to go way back. Dangerous by Design, when we did that first one, I think was a Transportation for America report. It was a kind of a reissue of a report that the old Surface Transportation Policy Partnership, STPP, they did a report called Mean Streets, which was the first version of this. And it is, some of the same methodology with the pedestrian danger index, which we have since moved away from. But yeah, I don't know how many exactly, because we've done it every 2 years for a while. We did one back-to-back years because of COVID data and how important it was to kind of we did one in 2021 and then 2022, but we usually do it every 2 years. So I don't know. I've lost count. I think I've been involved in this report 9 or 10 times at this point. It's been a lot.
Dangerous by Design is the name, and it's about streets, but it's mostly about pedestrian deaths. Is that right?
Yeah, and part of the reason it's really only about pedestrian deaths is because of some of the limitations in the data, because of the way the feds categorize death. There are like bike deaths, for example, in here. We have kids on skateboards that get categorized in with people using a wheelchair, an assistive device, and it becomes cleanest to just look at pedestrians, which is what we have always looked at in Dangerous by Design.
It's interesting. The European Commission just this week adopted regulations that would establish like a common set of urban mobility indicators, and it would require cities to use standardized data for traffic collisions and deaths across all of Europe, which is really fascinating. That makes me feel like we're behind a lot of ways because the European Union is just like, okay, we're going to standardize this for all cities. You all have to report this to us if you want funding. And so I think that that's interesting too, thinking about kind of the juxtaposition between like what they just did this last week. It was just this last week and what we do in terms of data collection and reporting and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to go and look at that. I mean, my initial response to that is it's yet one more way that we're having our lunch eaten by people in other places around the world. We have a whole section in this report. I think this is the first time we've done it too, where we made a global comparison. How does the US compare to its peers? Not just, how does the US compare to Norway or whatever with the lowest fatality rate in the world? We took a whole host of global peers. But on the data side, I mean, I think most people don't realize just how bad and inconsistent and most importantly, slow this data is. We call this report Dangerous by Design 2026. We release it in 2026. This data is through the end of 2024. We compare 2 5-year periods, so 2020 to 2024, and then 2015 to 2019. And, 2024 ends, and then it takes them all of 2025 and part of 2026 to aggregate that data at USDOT that comes from states and is reported by states and prepare it for release. This data, I think, came out in April of 2026. So it's 16 months after the end of the period you're looking at.
Too slow.
It's incredibly slow. And it's hard to say. There's not a transportation agency in the US that is willing to say that their top priority is anything other than safety. USDOT as well. And it becomes a really tough claim to make when we're not measuring safety well and we're not measuring safety with any urgency. I noticed actually just this week, the estimates come out from the GHSA, the Governor's Highway Safety Association, which is kind of the trade group for state highway safety officers that every state is required to have. And so they have kind of like preliminary numbers. They count things a little bit different than the feds do, and they release their estimates. But again, they're estimates.
Yeah.
It's not based on hard data. And in all the time that I've worked on this, other than small changes, in 2009, I think they added latitude and longitude so you could start to map the fatalities, which is something that we've always done to look at where they're happening. But other than that, there's not a lot that's changed with the data. We're still kind of doing the same things. The categories have barely changed over that time. There's a lot of growth. I mean, it's really exciting to have this model from the EU, perhaps, that could be worth emulating and looking into, because USDOT and NHTSA, they govern this process. They create this accident form for all the fatalities that are recorded that the states then have to use. So this is one of the areas that we identify in the report where it makes a lot of sense for there to be a little bit of a top-down solution. There's a lot of room for the feds to step in and really lead on the data gathering and collection side. There's a lot of things that need to happen from the bottom up on this, but that's one of the areas where it really makes sense for the feds to have a much stronger role.
So what does the data tell us then? What does the data that we can get tell us?
Well, it's Groundhog Day all over again. The headlines this last year, it really depends on who you ask. The NHTSA, I think it's the NHTSA administrator, when the data first came out, they declared American roads are safer. And it really it really comes down to what you're comparing that to. This last year, it was a small decrease of 3-4%, something like that. We had 7,000 people struck and killed while walking in 2024. That's roughly 19 deaths per day. While we're having this podcast, really good chance that someone's killed while walking somewhere in the US right now. That's the reality. If you back up a little bit, from 2009 to 2024, the total people killed while walking, struck and killed while walking, is up 72%. It's an insane rise. And, celebrating a 3% decrease at a time when we've just gotten back down to a number that I think is higher than every year on record since 1982, other than the last 3 years. That's not progress, and it's not worth celebrating. So while fatalities have ticked down slightly, and those GHSA numbers that I just saw this last week show that they may be ticking down again in 2025, we have a long way to go to get to a level that any of us should feel like is acceptable. And we have a long way to go just to get back to even just where we were 2 or 3 decades ago.
We talked to Julie Kirschbaum, the head of the FSF-MTA, last week, and I asked her about this comment from Jarrett Walker, which is he was on social media last week talking about like we're comparing ridership on transit agencies pre-pandemic to now, when we should actually be thinking like further into the future. We shouldn't be thinking about what it was then, which was not as good as we want it to be. We should be thinking about getting back to something that's even bigger, or changing what we think transit should do for us. And I feel like that's the same conversation that should be happening here, which is in 2013-ish, that area at the bottom of the Great Recession, that was the kind of the low, it seemed like a lowish point in that time period, if I was looking at the chart correctly. And then we just kind of shot back up. And, if we're trying to go a percent down of where we are right now, which is horrible compared to that 2013 number, but even if we go back to that 2013 number, that's still bad, right? Like, yeah, it's something that we need to like talk about, is like expectations and goals and, where we should be versus like what the charts tell us. I feel like sometimes we can get distracted by that, because ultimately the idea is to like not have any deaths overall, right? I realize that's a really hard goal at this point in time. But that discussion, I think, could change and be better.
Yeah, a great example. So we're in the middle of the World Cup, right? So we're all thinking about soccer. I'm a big DC United fan. I've been here in Washington, DC for 20 years. DC United, at least a handful of times in the last 6 or 7 years, has won what's called the wooden spoon. They give it to the team that finishes in last place with the least number of points. So I think in 2022, DC United won the wooden spoon with like 27 points. The top team in the league has 60, 70 points, something like that. The next year, we increased our points total for DC United by 48%. We got that 27 points up to 40, and we missed the playoffs for like the 10th year in a row. We won 3 more games than we did the season before. And if the ownership threw a party and wanted to brag about that, they would get eviscerated by their fans that are so frustrated. They are so frustrated with all of the losing. They don't want to be in 23rd place instead of 28th. They don't even want to be in 15th place because they don't want to miss the playoffs. They want to get in the playoffs. They want to finish first. They want to finish second. It's for a club that's won the championship, 4 times over the last 30 years or whatever. That's a lot like what we're dealing with here. Like, yes, wins are up, fatalities are down slightly. The standard that we should be going for is so much higher than did we make a 3 or 4% decrease. I think we have this in the report this time. If this progress that a lot of people were celebrating about the 2004 numbers, if we continued that progress, we wouldn't get back to where we were in 2009 until 2042. 2009, I think we had about 4,000 people struck and killed while walking.
So that was the low.
Not the lowest point. No, you're right about 2013. 2012, 2013, 2014, it started to flatline. And then 2014 to 2015, it jumped, and then it just kept jumping. There were a couple of years where it stayed, kind of flat in there, but it has been a pretty steady increase since 2009. 2009 might have been kind of the low point before it started to go back up. The overall high point, I think, is back in the 70s, just like traffic fatalities writ large were at their, highest levels of all time, all traffic fatalities in the 70s.
Yeah.
Before declining for a long time. But yeah, we have a long way to go. And that's part of what we wanted to do with the report this time in this section with the global comparisons is kind of resetting what the baseline is. I mean, by all means, we should say, hey, look, the needle moved in the right direction from 2024 compared to 2023. That's not bad news. That doesn't make it good news. And, slightly more safe, slightly less deadly is not the same thing as safe. So it's really about trying to hold ourselves to a higher standard. The other thing is, does anyone who's really claiming this is a victory, do they understand what we did? Did we do anything different? Because it feels like we're just kind of lucked into an increase. It's not like we dramatically changed anything in the last year or 2 or 3. I saw people pointing to the Safe Streets for All grants and projects. Like, so few of those are in the ground, and I'm sure they make a difference. But that's not gonna move the needle in the way that we need it to move. The scale of change is much greater, and we really want to start to hold the U.S. to a higher standard. And I mean, we can get into the numbers that we compare to globally, but like Canada's traffic fatality rate is like half of ours. Like Canada, for the most part, it looks a lot like the U.S., right? Go to Quebec and you'll see some signs in French, but you go to Toronto, you could be in a U.S. city. It's not dramatically different. It doesn't look dramatically different. The cars look pretty similar. You'll see people driving big trucks there. It's not all that different. And man, if we could just get to Canada's traffic fatality level, we would save thousands of lives every year. And that's a long way off. That's a long way off for us.
I want to go back to your soccer analogy for a second, because I think it has an interesting continuation, which is, the MLS keeps pushing back on promotion relegation, right? Going up and down in the soccer pyramid. In most leagues around the world, the top 3 teams are the ones that go to the Champions League, and the bottom 3 teams in your league are the ones that get relegated to the league below. There's actual consequences for not spending money or not getting the results that you want to. And so in this instance, in terms of like transportation policy, like, how do we get to a point where we can actually have those real tangible consequences for folks that are underperforming? Because the underperformance is they're trading consequences in terms of money and power and whatever else for people's lives, right? It's a clear trade-off for the ability to drive faster, right? So I'm wondering where we can get to a point where we can actually have consequences for not doing as well in terms of your ratings or the way that you address safety, because they're obviously saying safety, but they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah. What's relegation for traffic safety? What would that look like?
Well, it's like they did when you went to 55 miles per hour, or thinking about alcohol, right? You start taking away people's money. You start taking away people's money. And that's kind of what relegation is too. You don't get the money from the TV contract that you had anymore. And so there is something to say about having some consequences, like some ability to, say you didn't do this correctly. And so until you improve, we can't help you in this instance, or we can help you more until you improve, or something along those lines. I'm not sure, but maybe that, what does that look like?
Yeah, we have a rough outline for what that could look like. if we put any teeth on the system. Um, Bear with me just for a minute for a brief story about everyone's most favorite exciting topic, which is federal transportation reauthorization. It happens every 5 years, right? Sets all the policy and funding
Kind of every
levels.
5 years.
Kind of every 5 years. That's exactly right. We're at the very tail end of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in 2021 as part of the big infrastructure package, right? But go back to 2012. The thing that all the states and AASHTO, their trade organization, always has wanted forever, they will never stop asking for this, is more flexibility in how they spend the money, right? The Federal Transportation Program is essentially a federally funded, state administered block grant program. There are some restrictions on the funding, but for the most part, the feds hand blank checks to states and they can spend it, however they want. There's not a lot of performance required. So after years of saying we want more flexibility, the law in 2012, map 21, it essentially created a new structure for measuring performance, and the trade-off was we're going to give you more flexibility, we're going to get rid of some programs, we're going to consolidate them together, and then you're going to be free to spend this on the projects you think that you need are most valuable, but we're going to create this new system of performance measures where we're going to have to measure and assess, track things: safety, reliability, congestion. I think there's 9 total performance measures, right? But just laser in on what happened with safety. So they said we're going to create this safety performance measure. States are going to have to set targets each year for how many people are going to die on their roadways. And they did that. And the whole process got incredibly watered down during the, rulemaking regulation process. And essentially what it is now is like a pretty worthless paperwork exercise that honestly we would be better off without. The only use of this process right now is that it gives us some transparency into which states are at least thinking about safety in an ambitious way. Because you can go to the FHWA dashboard for all of these performance measures, and you can see what states are setting. And I don't know, the last time we looked at this, there were, I don't know, 15, 20 states that were setting targets, like literally saying in the next year, we are planning for more people to die on our roadways. Here is how we are planning to get there. And the problem with this system is not that the system exists, it's that there's no penalties. It's not binding. You're free to say more people are going to die. You can continue getting an increased amount of federal funding for that. When you meet those targets, you don't get penalized, you don't get a reward. If you're a state that lots of states set targets for fewer people to die in the coming years on their roadways. And some of those states are even spending money in a way where they're trying to get to that outcome. If they get there, do they get a reward? Do they get additional funding? No. If they don't get there, are they penalized? Do they lose money? Do they have to spend money on safety? No, they don't have to, right? But you can start to see the outline of what a program would look like that was oriented around safety. I think it would be something along those lines where, having money that goes down to states, we don't have a fundamental problem with that. The problem that we have is that we're getting a really incredibly bad return on the money that we're sending to states and even to metro areas. We've spent, whatever, $1 trillion in surface transportation funding at the federal level in the last, whatever it is, 20, 30 years, maybe since the Ice-T in 1991. And what do we have? The engineers say that our roads and bridges are in roughly the same shape as they were back then. Safety has only continued to get worse and worse. Why are we pumping more money into a program that is not oriented around accomplishing anything? So that would be like a really basic way to bring promotion and relegation, which I know there's a vibrant debate about that in the soccer world. I see you, pro rel truthers and those who are opposed. But that is a way that you could bring, promotion and relegation to the transportation arena. We don't even have to be prescriptive about how you get there, but say you have to reduce traffic fatalities or you're going to lose money. That's going to come with a penalty. And here is a whole suite of ways and solutions that are proven for things that you can go and do to make your streets and roads safer and try to get to those reductions that you say, is your top priority.
It's a bummer. I mean, there is a reward at the end, even if you don't get money, which is saving lives.
Yeah,
But
right.
that just speaks to like the fact that sometimes the money is actually more powerful than the lives that they might save. You know, it's
Hmm.
like, I know it's a rhetorical way to think about it, but
Hmm.
I also want to ask, like, if the money had strings, you know, what should they do with it? What should states do with the money to improve safety if they had the ability to, or if they were, you know, pushed into it? Like, what are the things that we should let them do or focus on instead of what they're doing now, which is obviously not working?
Yeah, I think step one is lasering in on the places that are the most dangerous. That's one of the things that is really great about this interactive map that everybody can find as part of Dangerous by Design. You can type in any address or, city. I think this version of it may be limited to the city, but it'll draw a bunch of dots in an area and it'll show you, 15, 16 years of pedestrian fatalities. And you can start to map your city's high, fatality network on your own. But every city knows, for the most part, where their most dangerous corridors and their most dangerous intersections are. Starting there should be step one. Looking at the last, I think, 5 years, a little more than half of all fatalities are on state-owned roads. The roads that the states own are by far the most dangerous out there. Design characteristics are all, pretty similar, pretty wide lanes, but they're all, for the most part, the really dangerous areas are places where we're trying to accomplish a bunch of goals that are opposed to one another at the same time. We're trying to make a corridor that can move people really, really fast. And we're also going to put driveways every 10 feet and have a million things that you want to see and do and stop at along that entire, stretch. You can't do these things at the same time. This is the Strode, right, that we've heard all about. So there's a million things that could be done to improve safety on these corridors. It's different in everyone, but it almost always involves finding ways to reduce speed, which is the number one culprit in these fatalities. The higher speeds are, the more likely people are to be killed. In ways that we probably are underestimating because some of this data and research on that factor is so very old at this point.
We had Eric Dunbar on recently, and I imagine you're familiar with Eric's work
Mhm.
at Florida Atlantic. But what's interesting about what he was talking about in his new research in the Journal of the American Planning Association was he's like, well, you know, European roads are very similar to US roads if you get outside of the cities. They're all somewhat similar. They're big and you can go fast, but the difference is the land uses around them.
Mhm.
And that's what causes the conflicts, right? People trying to get to places across a big road. They're trying to get to that gas station. They're trying to get to the big box store. They're trying to get to the grocery store. And that's a lot of where the conflicts happen. And so it's interesting to think about, like, the cities know where a lot of their conflicts are, right? They can pick it out and they can make some changes in terms of street design. But going forward, all of the sprawl and the exurban development that's happening, there probably should be something related to that too, because this is where a lot of those conflicts are going to happen in the future. And so if we can curtail that, and this is something that we've often talked about a lot, is land use and transportation are very, very tied together. But I thought that was interesting to think about it from that perspective rather than like just pure road design, but actually the design of our communities is kind of what the biggest problem is, especially on some of these arterial roads on the outskirts of towns.
Mhm. There's a story that I've held on to for a long time that I still share with people just because it was really powerful. There was this woman in Atlanta, I don't know, 2009, 2010, and one of her children was killed while she was crossing the street from a bus stop to her apartment complex. They had crossed and were on the like concrete median, and one of her children pulled out of her hand. It was basically a mid-block crossing, and it's like 3/4 of a mile to a controlled intersection with a light to her right, half a mile to a controlled intersection to her left. She did the very logical thing that she had probably done, dozens, hundreds of times, is walk from this bus stop that had been deliberately sited here because of the apartment complex that was across the street. That's a land use problem and a transportation problem. It's both things at once. And, the notion that we're going to ask somebody to walk, an extra 15 minutes just to get to something that they can see right across the street is insane. Put a light in, put a crosswalk in, find some way to make this safe, or don't site the bus stop there, which doesn't solve her problem, doesn't improve accessibility for the people that live there, but You can find tons of places where this is the problem. And, this video that we made about Orlando still has plenty of issues. I mean, their rate of death per 100,000 people is actually higher now than it was in 2019 when they were number one in our report. They're, I think, 25th in this report. But we profiled this corridor right near this elementary school, and it has this great aerial shot. You can kind of see it's kind of similar to the road I just described, where there's like, there's traffic lights pretty far apart, like maybe a mile apart, and they put in two separate, mid-block crossings with lights and signals and high-vis paint and widen the sidewalk. So it's technically like a multi-use path for them and their, terminology, big wide, like 10-foot sidewalk on one side. And those are the kind of interventions that are required when you have already made the land use decision of, having these things that people need on both sides of these streets that are, impossible or dangerous or incredibly uncomfortable to try to get across.
Yeah. What's wrong with Memphis?
What is wrong with Memphis? What's happened in Memphis is pretty incredible. Memphis, when we did this report, 15, 16 years ago, the first time, I mean, they were down below a whole bunch of places in Florida. Their pedestrian fatality rate, just the number of people killed per 100,000 of population, so adjusted for population, has tripled in the last like 10 years, maybe 15 years. It's 5 point something, I think, in the report this time. Just to put that in context, five point something deaths per 100,000 people. When we did this report in 2019, the highest rate in the country was, I think, Orlando at 3.5. So like Memphis and Albuquerque to some degree and number two have just surged so far out in front of everybody else. And as we talk to Memphis, I mean, the first problem they have is that they have a lot of incredibly dangerous arterials that are where the bulk of these deaths are occurring. As we've talked to people in Memphis, there's so many things going on in Memphis that it has just not been able to get to the top of the list of any elected leadership. There's not, as best as we can tell, and I'm sorry if I'm leaving someone out who's spoken about this issue and been a champion for it, but not the mayor, not anyone on the council has really like risen up and been like, guys, we have to do something about this. We have to change something. Maybe moments here and there, but as we talk to people down there, they're just like, we're having surges of crime, we're having homelessness, we're having, all these problems that they're trying to tackle, that it just hasn't risen to the top. And, kind of quietly over a decade, they've become far and away the most dangerous place for people on foot, with numbers that are, I mean, really kind of eye popping. Just, going from, whatever it was, 20, 30 people being killed a year to 60 or 70 just within the span of a couple of years. And they have these arterials, Poplar, Union, trying to remember the names of them, that for the most part are all state owned. So they have to work with the state on this, but it's tough to tell the state they're doing a bad job when the numbers aren't great on the streets that you own. And it doesn't look like your city is willing to do what it takes to make the streets safer that they control. There's wonderful things that they've done here and there. They've got some wonderful people working for the city we've talked to and have good relationships with. But again, it's the scale of the solution is just dramatically smaller than the scale of the problem. We're not going to get there doing very small street safety projects, one or two or three a year at a time. The number is just going to keep going the other direction until the response matches the scale of the epidemic that's really going on there in Memphis.
The other thing that I noticed from looking at the numbers was the amount of Native American, Native Alaskan deaths in terms of per capita. It was insane compared to everyone else. The Black population is really big too, but nowhere near what the Native population is. So I'm curious, like, is that because of just where it's located? You mentioned Albuquerque and New Mexico, I think that's part of it. But it's interesting to read that and be like, well, what's going on? What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's incredibly disproportionate risk. That's the thing I think that a lot of, and why maybe this doesn't register sometimes for a lot of people as a disaster, because it's like, it doesn't happen where they live. It doesn't happen to people that they know, maybe. I think the stats on income tell us a lot about why that's happening.
Mm.
This is another thing that's, missing from the federal database. We don't have information on the income of people who are killed, but we do have income by census tract where they were killed. And it's really striking if you look at, try to find a census tract where the median income is over $100,000 or $75,000 or whatever, and the fatality rate is so small as to barely be able to make it onto the chart. And you go down to the lowest census block, quartile, and that's where almost all the lion's share of these deaths are happening. Take take Memphis, for example. If they're only doing, 3 or 4 or 5 like really ambitious safety projects a year where they're really like spending money to reconfigure an intersection or add a really complicated, expensive mid-block crossing that requires, planning and engineering and some traffic studies and that sort of thing. Are those going to go, all things being equal, to the part of town that has no political clout and lower incomes and people that aren't as engaged in the process because they're working 3 jobs to barely make ends meet? It's easy to see how these things happen and how, again, when the interventions that you need, the scale of them are enormous and they're not going to happen everywhere. But the places where they're most needed, and it makes a really good argument for, with very limited resources, trying to steer these to the places that are the most dangerous, not the places that, have the people most agitating for something necessarily.
Looking at the map, you can see kind of this explosion of low marks for like the Sun Belt and
Hmm.
very sprawly type development. In California, I was like, oh, California. But then I was looked at where it was is the Bakersfields and
Yeah,
the
inland.
Sacramentos and inland in the Central Valley. But a lot of these places, and it kind of goes back to that comment I made about Eric's discussion about Europe, is like cities that developed pre-war versus post-war seems like a big difference there. And we know that places like Davis, California, which have huge, numbers of people who are biking and stuff like that. And Norm Garrick and Wes Marshall and others have done research on looking at, the crash rates and things like that for these places who have really tight street grids versus the ones who are, sprawling and have the dendritic, more flowy floral types of systems. And so I think that's really fascinating too, to look at it from the geographic perspective, which is like that Sun Belt growth has actually led to a lot of this kind of carnage.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It gives you a huge leg up, especially on the design side, when you have an incredibly constrained right of way. Is it Hoboken that hasn't had a, traffic fatality in
Yeah.
a few years, right? I think Jersey City is somewhere similar. Um,
Somerville as well. Just like there was a thing today about Somerville too.
Yeah, so Somerville's interesting because it's a little bit different, just the physical design of the streets, I think, compared to even a place like Hoboken. But like Hoboken, just it's wonderful what they've done, and you absolutely can have carnage on a street grid of narrow streets. There's plenty of places that have
Yeah.
shown that that's possible. So it's wonderful the stuff they've done, daylighting their intersections and slowing speeds and all that stuff. It's wonderful. They absolutely should keep doing it, and places should copy them, but they don't have a lot of 6 lane, arterials. They don't have a road that has the, suicide turning lane down the middle. They don't have anywhere that's, where it's like just a mile between safe, quote unquote, safe crossings where there at least might be a painted crosswalk and a traffic light. So yeah, it makes a huge difference. I mean, I think the thing that we don't understand about that, it's not like it's just because these places are sprawling and they're sunbelty and it's kind of new growth. It's that we built these roads up to a standard, and the
Yeah.
standards are terrible. The standards are the problem. The standards are what needs to change. I mean, this is a huge topic to get into. I'm sure you talked to, Wes and others about this. There's tons of latitude for places to follow these standards in a way that's a lot safer and use their engineering judgment to design streets that are safer. You don't have to have 13-foot lanes in a place when you can get away with 11 feet lanes, but they do that because that's been the practice, that's been the status quo. Like there's just so much inertia in that system. But there's plenty of places within that Sun Belt and within these places that are the most dangerous where you can find success stories. Like you can find places that have done things different. You can find places that had a dangerous corridor, that have made interventions, that have made crossings come at the expense of vehicle speeds, but it's made a better place for people to live in and travel within rather than just for people to travel through. So it's definitely true that a lot of this is in the Sun Belt and in these places that have mostly had their population boom post 1950. But a lot of that, it hasn't just happened organically. It's happened because we designed these things this way on purpose. And it's not set in stone that it has to be that way. And infrastructure changes. It's going to can look very different in those places in just 10 or 20 years, the same way that they look very different right now than they did 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah. And you'd think that cities would want to curtail kind of wasteful use of their land, right? So, or people's land. The excess land seems to have caused people to build these really crazy wide roads because you have access to it. I know in Bakersfield, where my brother-in-law and my sister live, there's like some super crazy wide roads that you're never going to need to expand it that much, and you're never going to carry that many cars. It looks like they have, 2 lanes, but it looks like it was built for a 6-lane road that's never coming. And
Yeah.
so that is insane too, in terms of like the design of it and how the safety reflects that over time. So with, housing crisis and as it is, like, that land could be used for something else too.
Yeah. And I mean, this is another place where the federal program really just sort of enables it because, states are able to spend this money on roads that there's no way they're going to be able to maintain every lane mile of these insane, scale roads that they're building. But, we pass a new federal reauthorization that everybody swears has to be, 20 or 30% bigger than the last one because, we've got to invest in our infrastructure and whatever. And, everybody comes to DC claiming we've got to repair our crumbling roads and bridges and we've got to fix everything. And then they get a whole bunch of money and they go out and build a bunch of new stuff that all comes with 50, 75 years of locked in maintenance costs. They're all liabilities, to channel my strong towns hat. Like that's how we've got to think of them, but we keep bailing places out. So to me, that's one of the places where you can start to make a difference. Like cut off this spigot of just, I mean, that's not coming from the gas tax, by the way. It's just coming from all taxpayers, and it's coming from your grandkids are paying for this stuff that they're going to have to find some way to maintain. And there's just not the money for it. So cut the spigot off for this stuff, and I think you'll see safety improve.
Yeah. What's going on in Provo besides BYU?
That's a really great question. I've never been to Provo, but they have been down at the bottom of the list for a while, haven't they?
Looks like it.
Yeah. And Utah has famously like pretty wide roads, right?
Yeah, the story anyway is that
Turn
especially
the
turn the wagon, right? You got to
yeah,
turn the wagon around on your road. So in order to get those oxen turned around, you have to have a wide road, which is the fable. I think I'm not sure how true it is. It could be very true or not true, but that's the story I've been told.
well, I may depart even from some of my colleagues on this count, but I do think design is the most important yet under discussed factor in traffic safety. The cues that the streets that and roads that we drive on give to us that tell us to drive fast, that tell us you don't have to pay a lot of attention here, even though you're going through a place with tons of complexity and people and the most dangerous kinds of streets, all that stuff. I think that's the most important factor. But people do behave differently in different places. I do think there's some truth to that as you look at some of these lists and having just, if you spend any time traveling the country and, going around, if you live in a place where you feel like people drive nuts and you can visit some other places and be like, wow, it just seems like a little chill here. I don't think it's the thing I mean, look, we do far too much blaming victims and, blaming drivers and making this all about behavior, and we need to enforce it all out and that kind of thing. I think the best street is a self-enforcing street that, has a speed limit of 25 and was designed for 25, not 45. We we last summer we had a chance to drive from DC up to Maine, and we were in Burlington, Vermont, lovely city in the summertime. I think as a Southerner, I don't know if I want to be there in January, but my kids are all city kids and they're used to looking out for themselves when they cross the street and, assuming that the street they're crossing, the light's going to turn red and like 2 or 3 people are going to blaze through there. You don't just look at the walk sign, they're streetwise. And we were walking in downtown Burlington, and like before we have gotten to the stop sign up the street, we could see somebody slowing down to like, it's a crosswalk with no stop sign. And they're like, we're going to go ahead and stop and, wave you. And we're in places like that. And it was just like, behavior can be a little bit different in places. And certainly in places where there's a lot of like social cohesion. too, I think, and people know each other, and maybe it hasn't changed a lot over a period of time. I have no idea if that's what's going on in a place like Provo or not, but I do think there's something to that. I think in some places behavior is different. I think behavior is largely shaped by the environment, around us, that we give people, that we give drivers and people walking and biking and everything else. That's the best way to keep people safe, but behavior really factors into it too. But I would love for people in Provo to come and pipe up and let us know what they've got going on out there. Send us some pictures and video so that we can see it, because their numbers are good, certainly compared to the other end of this list.
Yeah. I talked with Kevin Kryzak and Tila Duam about their emergency streets idea, and it's interesting because it's basically their idea is that like when there is a collision and somebody dies, you should go out there immediately and change the street with cones and do some tactical urbanism like in that spot, and then also let people that come later in the day that didn't see this crash happen know that something happened. Because what happens often is like, there's a collision in the morning, it gets cleaned up, and then nobody's none the wiser about what happened there earlier in the day. Maybe there's a little bit of taillight glass on the concrete or whatever. You've seen this before. But just kind of like letting people know that like there is danger out there, and that, there's something to be said about alerting people to that danger. And so I'm interested in that too, is like, what are some of the things that we could possibly do to like, aside from numbers on a page, aside from like, police reports or the local news telling you that something happened, like letting people know that there are dangers in the streets, and maybe they would be more understanding or receptive if they saw it happen more often, which is when it actually happens, versus like it being just kind of brushed over and under the rug.
Yeah, I think those kinds of models that do things really urgently and quickly, I mean, that part of it, I think that's tremendous. The emergency streets, the crash analysis studio that Chuck and Strong Towns have gotten together, I think is really wonderful. The thing that I think that is great about it is that it recognizes the urgency that I think a lot of people do feel. So especially when somebody's killed while walking, like in a neighborhood, like that really kind of ripples through with people when it happens. A lot of people's cynicism about government and cynicism about whether or not anyone cares, you can draw it back to I mean, a lot of these places where these things happen are like, it's places where somebody's been crying out for a crosswalk or an intersection or slower speeds or whatever it is for years and years, and it keeps happening, and nothing, there's some project that's always 5 years off, been in the planning process or whatever. I think that's one of the most exciting things that I've seen especially in the last 10 years, taken a lot of forms, tactical urbanism or quick builds or better block, whatever it is. We kind of teach a model of this with local communities we've been doing the last few years. But the urgency that people feel at the local level and their willingness, people that, I mean, may not agree about much else, will all come together and rally together to make some changes in a short-term way, and that doesn't cost a lot of money, and you can prove these things and let people test them out. I was listening to Beth, our CEO, was talking about this, and it's funny because it's something I talk about and I still do communications trainings from time to time. Change is really, really hard. When people face change, it produces anxiety, right? It's our immediate response to anything that's different is anxiety. And when we get anxious, our like rational brains immediately shut down. And we're not ever going to make any decisions at that point about something in a rational way. So when you're talking about a big, complicated, expensive multi-year infrastructure project that's going to take away this parking lane or make some huge change, like people are just predisposed to be really anxious about it and not be able to make a good decision about how they feel about it, not, at least not a rational decision. So this idea of being able to, at really low cost, design something and put something that people can react to and test and see and experience, and rather than having to lean on what they might think about it if it gets built, you can instead see how they do handle it in reality. Does this make you safer? Does it make things more dangerous? Does it slow things down or not? You're not having a theoretical argument or discussion anymore about it. I think this is terrific. And I think the idea of especially with the pedestrian deaths, saying immediately rushing to the scene and saying, why did this happen? What can we do tomorrow to make this safer? What can we do, next month, 6 months, a year from now? Like, what does the scope look like to make this safer? I think that's great. And the rise of people willing to do the temporary projects, and now encouraged at the federal level with Safe Streets for All grants for the last few years. I think that's wonderful, and hopefully that's something that can help people see the kinds of changes that are needed, and also that they're nothing to fear. It's not a big deal. It's going to make your community a better place, a safer place for everybody that needs to use it.
Last one. Is there anything you wish people would ask you that usually you don't get asked?
No, I mean, I think this whole report in some ways is a response to the thing that not that people aren't asking about, but that people aren't talking about, which is design. Every transportation agency in the country runs a safety campaign of some kind, whether it's, wear your seatbelt or some ill-conceived something that goes on the back of the bus that, blames people for walking or tells them to wear bright clothing or, whatever. We're always talking about education. I don't know that it's moving the needle. We've had a lot of talk in the last 10 years about enforcement, especially in the age of Black Lives Matter and rethinking the approaches that we've, long leaned on, and could they be different? But the thing that we just have not talked about, that people don't want to ask about, which is why we do this report, is design. How does the design of the streets and roads that we use affect our behavior? We don't want to think of ourselves as, we're free will beings that can do whatever we want, and we're not affected by our environment. But the data and the research says otherwise. And how we drive and how we behave behind the wheel, it's totally shaped by the environment around us. So not necessarily a question that you didn't ask, but it's really at the heart of this report. We want people talking about design and thinking about what kind of designs, what kind of changes, what kind of interventions can really move the needle in the way that we need to get this number down from 7,000 people a year to zero one day. We want to see this go away as an issue, but we have a long way to go.
Where can folks find the report if they want to get it and download it and check out all the numbers and look at what Utah's doing and Provo and Albuquerque and whoever else?
If you just Google Dangerous by Design 2026, you'll find it pretty quick, but it's on our website at smartgrowthamerica.org.
Awesome. I'll put in the show notes too. And then where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
You can find my information there on the website. Yeah, I used to be on Twitter. That's not really a thing so much anymore. So find me there, and my email address is on there. Anybody who wants to connect, I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, Steve, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's great to be on here, Jeff. Appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter as well, and find everything else, including multiple ways to support the show, at theoverheadwire.com. You can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.